everyone. Today's lesson is on the camera and exposure. Today's super exciting because you get to learn all about your camera and the three components that make up exposure, which is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And you'll be able to control this through the manual mode setting on your camera. So starting off, I found this really nice quote online that I thought really described the camera very well and the different mechanics of the camera. And it says that the camera is a device capable of capturing still or moving images by using light. Everything that surrounds us looks a certain way because of light, and without it, we wouldn't have colors, highlights, shadows, or contrast. The camera takes advantage of that by combining optics and mechanics, chemistry and electronics, in such a way that light gets imprinted on light-sensitive material. In the case of analog cameras, the medium is a photographic film. In the case of digital cameras, the medium is an electronic sensor. Both the film and sensor react differently to different amounts of light, therefore recreating the scenery in front of the camera. So starting off with the single lens reflex, or the SLR, which is the analog camera, or as we know, also the film camera. This is the classic, and this has been around for a very, very long time, but it's still around today, which is really awesome. So I'm loving that film is not dead, and I don't think film ever will be dead because it's just so great. But basically, film requires a roll of film to be able to take photos. And because of this, there are a limited number of photos that you can take, usually around 36 images. There is no ability to preview or delete images, which is also a great thing and maybe a not so great thing, because sometimes you can pick up your roll after it's been developed and you can see that everything was exposed and overexposed, and just like there's not one good photo that actually developed well or that was taken well. So that can be frustrating, but it's also very exciting because you can't even see the photo that you took until you've gotten the images developed. And especially in today's day and age where we're always on our screens, I can see how the film camera is just really awesome to be able to take that out and be kind of like without any sort of electronic sort of technology around you. So that's really awesome about the film camera. And also, film can be expensive to purchase, so that's just one thing to consider. But overall, the film camera is a classic, and I'm glad that it's still being used today. And moving into the digital single lens reflex, or as we know, the DSLR. This is when the single lens reflex turned to digital. So it's a digital camera, and this has been the standard for a very long time. And we have to give credit to the DSLR for really paving the way for the technology that we have today, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But in order to record images, this uses a SD card, and because we have SD cards with different sizes and different ranges of being able to hold however many photos or videos that you would like, there's close to an unlimited amount of photos that you can keep on there depending on your SD card size. And there's also the ability to preview or delete images, which is like a really awesome thing about digital cameras, because before you wouldn't even be able to see any of the images that you took on a SLR. And now with the DSLR, you're able to preview everything. You're able to see where you've made mistakes. You're able to fine tune things. You're able to store so many images, not just 36 images. So it was really a great, amazing technology that really paved the way for the different technologies that we have today. And the DSLR and the SLR camera, they are similar because they reflect light onto a mirror so that it can be seen in a viewfinder. And the way that this works is that, as you can see, the viewfinder, where your eye looks through, there's nothing that you can see out of directly right here. So actually, you're looking through the lens and you're seeing light or the image outside enter through the lens. The way that it can get up to the viewfinder is that there's a mirror that then flips the image into the pentaprism, and then that goes to you where you can see it through the optical viewfinder. So it's a very cool technology in the inside of this camera and how we can see the outside world through this viewfinder and looking through the lens. This video is really important for you to watch. I play this in my in-person classes. Basically all these videos that I have linked to you in Canvas, but also in this PowerPoint slide. This these are all the videos that I play in my in-person classes. So it's really important that you watch these. I really particularly love this video because it shows exactly how a DSLR camera works. This is by F-Stoppers, and I really encourage you to watch it. The video is very engaging. It shows all the different components, just like this image here, but like you can also see the shutter, the shutter speed working, and how when you click the shutter, the mirror moves out of the way and flips up, and that's how light is exposed onto the image sensor and creates an image, and the shutter comes down, or sorry, the shutter then closes and the mirror comes back down. So it's very cool how we can see all these things through this video. So definitely watch it. And then this next video is called Inside a Camera at 10,000 frames per second. And this is by the slow-mo guys. This is like a very zoomed in image of the shutter speed, or basically the shutter going off in your camera and seeing it at a very slow motion. And it's really awesome to see how much light enters with the different shutter speeds. So today's technology, the mirrorless camera, this is the future, and we have to pay homage to the DSLR that paved the way for this technology, because this camera does not have a mirror, as I've said, and yeah, I will talk about how the DSLR paved the way for this, but not even just by the look and the different components, but basically the DSLR had this thing called live mode, and if you have a DSLR that still has it, DSLRs are still around. They just may not be continuing to make DSLRs anymore because they're really concentrated. The camera market is really concentrated on making mirrorless cameras, because they are the future. So there used to be this thing on the camera, or it still is a thing, called live mode, where you would click it and it would show you this electronic version of the outside world. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But it's kind of the same concept with mirrorless cameras. So getting more into this particular slide, the mirrorless camera also requires an SD card similar to the DSLR to record images. It's close to unlimited number of photos depending on the SD card size. There's also, of course, the ability to preview or delete images, so same thing as DSLR. A unique thing is that it uses an electronic viewfinder, which I will talk about in a little bit. And of course, latest technology, compact and sleek, travel friendly. And here are the differences between a mirrorless and a DSLR, just in like the physical form. You can see that a mirrorless camera is a lot smaller. The bulk is cut down. The DSLR is a lot bigger, heavier. Yeah, just very different. I have found, and I think a lot of you maybe can attest to the same thing if you ever held a mirrorless camera, it is really compact. So like it just doesn't feel as comfortable. Like things are really just like close together when you're trying to like navigate through the buttons, like everything's really tight. Versus a DSLR, like it's just real a lot more ergonomic in terms of like it just feels really comfortable to hold in your hands. So you can see like this is where you would hold, you'd put your hand around the DSLR to hold it and to take a photo. You know, you're using one hand for a lot of those different functions. And then here you can see it's a lot smaller. It's just like, you know, it's not as comfortable. So that's the one negative maybe that I would say about the mirrorless. But yeah, just in size, it's very, very different. So now going into what I was kind of talking about, like that live mode view. So as you can see, the DSLR in live mode would show the image from the image processor onto the LCD monitor here. And so instead of looking through the optical viewfinder, if you hit the live mode, you could see it in a bigger screen. And also with that, like when you're adjusting different settings, which we'll talk about later, um, that basically change the exposure of your image, you could see that all happening and previewing live in live mode on the LCD monitor here. So that same concept is then applied to the mirrorless camera here. And but this one, of course, is not using the mirrorless. So if you're in live mode, that means the mirror is up, so that way you can see what's going on in the LCD monitor. But here, the mirrorless camera, there is no mirror, so there's no need to like use a pentaprism or a mirror or anything like that. The light enters directly into the camera. It then is exposed onto the image sensor, and the image processor processes that information, which then is seen on the LCD monitor, but also seen in the electronic viewfinder. So that's something that was really weird for me to get used to, and I still don't really like it. When I look at the electronic viewfinder, it's just, you're looking at a screen. So if you're trying to get away from more screens, that's not where you're really going to get away with a mirrorless camera. So it's really strange to look into the viewfinder just through this tiny screen for me. But usually when I use my mirrorless, I'm looking at the big LCD monitor in the back, similar as I did when I was using a DSLR and using it in live mode. So SD and CF cards, these are your storage devices or memory cards that you use to record images on. And as you can see here in this camera, there is an SD card slot, which is a lot smaller, and then a CF card slot that is bigger. SD stands for secure disk, CF stands for compact flash. And yeah, these are ways that you can record photos and videos onto the disk, and then being able to upload that to your computer, your laptop, whatever, and have your photos stored. Um, so as you can see, the SD card here, it's a lot smaller, it's more portable. The Apple computers finally brought back the SD card slot after many years. I feel like it was like 5 years without it, or more, that we didn't have an SD card slot, and now it is back, which is the greatest thing ever. So it's really easy to just take the SD card out of your camera, put it into your computer. If you're a PC user, you never had an issue. But basically, yeah, it's just like really portable, easy, and just efficient. And then the CF card is bigger. You need a SD card, CF card reader, which usually you saw them for our class materials, but they're this just extra component that you need to attach to your laptop or your computer to then be able to see your images. But the positive thing about CF cards is that they are more durable. They are larger, like in size, but just in general, they are more durable. And let's say if you're like photographing a lot of events or something, you can have like just in this image your SD card and your CF card both in there, and when one of them gets stored up, it can go to the CF card, and vice versa. You can just continue to take images and more videos, etc. So you can use both of them at the same time. So yeah, I really enjoy the CF card. It just is like I said, really durable. What I will say about the SD card is that with time, if you've seen the back of it in general, like there's this like little chip, and you will see there that sometimes it can, like, over time it will just, like, the plastic will kind of fray off. And I've had that happen before where the plastic of the SD card just kind of separates. So yeah, that's a little scary. And that probably means it's time to get a new SD card. But yeah, compact flash, just really durable. Like, obviously you don't want to like let things fall and hit the ground, but if it does, it should be pretty okay because it's just larger and just better. Um, but as you can see here, there's different sizes. So I would say nowadays common SD cards is like 16 gigabytes all the way up to 128 gigabytes, and it goes even further, I think, to 258 if I'm not wrong. Um, but that's the amount of storage it has, and the larger the number, the more storage there is. So a good range, I would say, would be like within the 30 and 60s range. So I think like there's 32 gigabytes and 64 gigabytes. That's a pretty good range to have for photos. The videos, you obviously need more storage, so really it's common to have 128 gigabytes and further. So yeah, just a little bit of a background on those numbers. So I would say anything above 16 gigabytes is great. All right, so now going into manual mode. So manual mode, this is M on the dial of your camera. This allows you to control the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all separately. And this is what you should know to be able to use your camera and really take the photo and be able to understand all the different components and have an idea in place in exactly like how you want that photo to look, and creating that in your camera with manual mode. So here's an example of these flowers in the setting and the differences between auto and manual mode. Auto mode that's the camera deciding what it thinks that you want, what the correct lighting it is necessary that the camera needs to make up to create this image. So it'll kind of assess automatically with the light meter, and we'll talk about that stuff in a little bit. What would be the correct settings for that? And automatic mode is pretty good, but things can always be better and things can be more customized. And that's why we love manual mode. So as you can see in auto, just straight off the bat, the photo is like pretty dark. Yeah, it's kind of moody, it's kind of nice, but overall it's kind of dark. It could be better. Like you can see inside of this, these flowers, like it's just really, there's not much dimension happening here. It's just like there could be lighter areas, etc. And in manual mode, you can really control those functions, and you want to have a lot of different values, range of tones and highlights and shadows in your image. And so in manual mode, you can really control that, and you can see how the image is a lot lighter. There's just more things going on in terms of the tones, the shadows, the highlights, everything is just really nicely done straight off the bat when you're taking the photo from the camera and then going in to edit it. Like it kind of creates less work for you if you're on manual mode and you're really trying to design how you want to take that image and then putting it into different softwares, which we'll talk about later, for editing. And, you don't really have to do as much editing in that way once you become a really experienced photographer who has used and learned manual mode. Versus like auto, this one I would probably need to edit a lot more to bring all these different highlights back because there's a lot of shadows that are just really dark here, for example. So the trifecta, the exposure triangle, this is made up of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and that's what we're going to be talking about next. So aperture, this is the difference between a small aperture or a large aperture. So just visually, this is your lens, it's closing down, and you have a small aperture here versus having a large aperture, and those will create different types of looks in your photo, and also one is letting in more light and one is letting in less light, and it is how it looks. So a smaller aperture will let in less light, a larger aperture will let in more light. So when you're thinking about aperture, you want to think about how much depth do you want in your image, or how much of the image do you want in focus. And we're also going to be talking about depth of field and what a small or deep depth of field looks like, because that also plays into aperture. So aperture is measured in f-stops or focal stops. And as we can see here, it goes from something called an f2 all the way down to an f22. And so that is what an f-stop is: f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16, f22, sorry. Yes, those are all the numbers. So that's how you would read it. As you can see here, f2 is a large aperture. The aperture is letting a lot of light in, it is open, and you can see that the number, though the aperture is large, the number is actually small. Whereas on the other end, this is a small aperture, but the number f-stop is large. So it's a little bit opposites, but you'll definitely understand it later on. So yeah, let's look into some examples. Here, again, we see the little examples of the different f-stops here, the large aperture being open and the smaller aperture here being closed down. So as you can see, we have an f22, and what that gives us is a smaller aperture, obviously a larger number here, but the image, there is a lot of depth of field happening, a deep depth of field happening in this image. And that means that there's, in this image, when you're trying to take a photo of a person in the pyramids, you're getting all of that field, that range in focus. And then on the other end, something like an f1.4, you can barely see the background in focus. You can't even make up how close or how far it is. The subject is in focus. Everything else is blurry. And that's what happens when you have a large aperture and there's a lot of light coming through at an f1.4. That's when you're getting that really blurry look in the subject in focus. On the other end, to come back to the f1.4, that means that we have a shallow depth of field. So there's a lot of blurriness happening. And then at f22 is a deep depth of field. There's like everything is in focus, right? And then in the middle here, there's f5.6. That's a middle range. You can see the background. It's like a little bit blurry, but you kind of make out the distance between the subject and the background here. So that's a good mid-range. And here's another diagram. I've got a lot of diagrams in this presentation just because I think it's really, there's a lot of different ways to understand it, and it's good to see multiple ways of looking at things. So here they describe a large aperture as a wide aperture, and then a narrow aperture as a small aperture. And you can see how at like something like a f1.4, the person is in focus, the background is blurred out, light floods in and less is in focus, shallow depth of field occurs. The way on the end, f22, this person is in focus and also the background is in focus. The light funnels in and more is in focus. Deeper depth of field occurs. Some more examples here of an f1.8 versus an f8 and f22 and what kind of look you're going to get with these different apertures. So if you have three different people standing in a line with distance between them, you can see that the person in the center is focused at an f1.8, but the person in front of them and behind them are blurred out. At an f8, you can see that the person in front and behind are a little bit blurred out, but they're still kind of getting in focus here. And then finally in f22 with a small aperture, everybody's shown throughout the image. Another example here of an f2.8. Now you can kind of see like the ISO and the shutter speed. Those are things that we'll talk about in a little bit. But at an f2.8, we can see that there is a lot of blur happening here. This is also called bokeh or bokeh. I don't know the correct way that people say it. I've said bokeh for a really long time. But either way, tomato, tomato, or maybe you disagree. But yes, here, the f2.8, it really creates this blurry background for these flowers and creates like this little effect. The bokeh, that's like, I guess maybe I'm using it incorrect, but that's like more so for like lights where you see that lights are turning into like little circles, but I can also see these kind of turning into little circles and you can see that these flowers are more detailed here. But yeah, overall just a blurry background. And then at f5.6, which is in the middle, you can see that the flowers are in focus in the front and then you can see the background, but the background area is just still a little blurry. And then next we have something at an f11, so not quite as extreme as the f22. And you don't always need to go that far to get everything else in the image in focus. It depends on like how close or how far you are from the object. But this subject is more in focus in the camera itself, or sorry, closer in the camera itself when we're viewing it from the lens. So they're not that far away from the subject. So here you can see that everything is pretty much in focus in the background at f11. Obviously not as sharp as it would be with the f22, but for this example, these are the ranges. Another example here, kind of similar to the people in this image, right? We can see that at f2.8, the quarter in the middle is in focus, but the one in the back and in the front, they are more blurred out. At an f11, you can see that there is a lot more detail happening here. There's a deeper depth of field happening, but still this quarter in the front is still kind of blurry. The quarter in the back is also still kind of blurry. And then we go all the way up to f32, and you can see that the quarter in the front and the quarter in the back is all detailed, especially all the texture that's happening from the very beginning to the end of this photo here. It's all in focus. So it's important to remember that aperture does allow for a depth of field, that being shallow and that being a deep depth of field. So here you can actually recognize it as a field. So like, for example, in this shallow depth of field at f1.8, this is how much is in focus, or yeah, basically how much is in focus, the range there. So anything behind that is going to fall out of focus. At an f5.6, if your subject is, let's say the subject's on the blue line, right? Um, that means that only this range, all the way up to here, that is in focus. And then of course, like same thing, anything in front or behind this falls out of focus. And then a deep depth of field, you can see that a lot is in focus. So yeah, hopefully that is making more sense here. Another diagram chart that shows a lot of the things that we already talked about. It shows aperture from f1.4, allowing a lot of light in, also allowing for a blurry background, and something like, or maybe I should go more to the f2.8, right? So f2.8 right here. This is allowing for a blurry background and lets a lot of light in. The depth of field is a lot smaller and shallower. And then here at an f5.6, the lens, the aperture is smaller, and therefore there is more depth of field happening here, and the image is becoming a little bit more focused on the background. And then lastly, at the bottom here, f11, the aperture is pretty small here. There is more depth of field, less light coming in, and the image itself is even more in focus through the front to the back. Sorry, I was like kind of talking and just getting a little confused over my words, but here when I was said smaller, I meant that shallower, and then I meant that the aperture is larger here. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. So this is also something that comes into effect when we think about exposure. We can't just like set these numbers and think that everything is going to look amazing. So for f-stop in your aperture, everything you do is going to lighten or darken the image, right? Because we talked about how much more light is coming in at f1.8, f1.4 versus how much less light is coming in at f16. So you have to make up for that with the other functions that we're going to be talking about in a little bit that also create and help in creating exposure. So at an f1.8, you can see that the aperture is larger. There's a lot of light coming through versus at an f22, the aperture is a lot smaller, so there's less light coming through. And that's when we work with things like shutter speed and ISO, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that basically get the image to something like this, which is what would be a good, pretty decent image that is not too light or too dark. So just know that everything you do with your aperture also affects how much light is going into the camera. And I know we can kind of obviously look at that and think of that in that way in these diagrams, but I think this is a really good visual idea of how that would actually look when you're actually taking a photo. You know, an f2.8 is going to give you a really different result than something like an f11, and you'll have to compensate and make up for that light loss if you want to have an image where things are more in focus, with an f11 that you can see things in the background. If there were things in the background, you would want to keep that and then make up for that with the other functions of the camera. So this is another example of how aperture changes exposure. Again, you can see at f2.8 in this outside environment. We'll also talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, the outside environment is like very, very bright. The lens is letting in a lot of light. The aperture is letting in a lot of light. And then here at a f22, you can barely see anything because the aperture is really small. A lot of light is not coming in. So just a small amount of light is coming in. So you can see the differences there. So actually in this environment, in this time of day, these are things that we'll go over in a little bit. But there is f5.6 and f8. Those actually, I would say, yeah, anywhere between f5.6 or f8 looks like the correct exposure that we would want to work with for taking an image in this environment. Next is shutter speed. So how much motion do you want in your image? That's something that you would want to consider when you're thinking about shutter speed. Do you want a freeze motion or do you want a blur motion? So here are some examples of freezing motion and seeing how cool shutter speed is. These are things that we can't see with our own eye, right? When like a glass shatters or when we see like this water just like spewing out of this glass, that's not something that we can see and like with our own eyes, it will happen very, very quickly. So shutter speed freezes these moments and creates a really cool image. Same thing with motion blur. Um, Maybe this would be similar to something that would actually see if we looked at it, right? Because like we can't really process things moving really fast very well either. But you can see how this ride and these people on it, they all become very, very blurry, but the actual ride itself is in focus because it's not the part that's moving. And the effect of getting these like beautiful waterfall, just like milky type of look for the water, that is done with a long exposure, as we would call it, which is a long shutter speed and having the shutter speed open for a long amount of time. So shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second and all the way up 2 seconds and so on and so forth. But here we can see that at half a second, so right here, if somebody is running, you can see their body is kind of trailing when you take an image. And at a fourth of a second, an eighth of a second, 15th of a second, you can see that there is still a lot of motion happening all the way from 30th of a second to 60th of a second, you can see that it's progressively getting a little bit better. Some motion is being more frozen. At a 60th of a second, this was taught to me and might be changed today, but like a 60th of a second, you should be able to um, click your shutter by holding your hands, like without a tripod, holding it in your hands and taking a photo of someone, and you should be able to freeze the motion at a 60th of a second handheld. But obviously, going above that is great. So I usually take a photo minimum, like I usually set it at 100th of a second if I can. But you can see at 125th of a second, 250th of a second, 500th of a second, the motion uh, is even more frozen. So from freezing the person running versus to blurring the person running here. And then another diagram here that also talks about like the same idea of somebody running. Um, at 2 seconds or at 1 second, a half a second, you can see it's really, really blurry. And also the image is a lot brighter because the shutter speed, when you click it, it remains open for that 1 second or for that half a second. And that is allowing for more light to come in. And then on the other side here, something like a 2,000th of a second, it's a lot faster, which means that the shutter is opening and closing super, super fast, which is letting in less light, creating a darker image. So the more that you increase your shutter speed, the darker your image will also become, and that's how you freeze motion. So all of these things affect light entering into your camera and exposing an image. Here are some more examples of like if you wanted to, for example, take a photo of stars or star trails, water in action, just some examples, somebody walking. Oh, so here they say 125th of a second is good for somebody walking. So like I said, back when I was in school, a 60th of a second was like what you could do without putting your camera on a tripod and you could do it handheld. But yeah, even trying to capture someone walking, you even want to be at 100, something higher, like 125th of a second. So yeah, just definitely something to go back to if you want to like check out this and try these different types of shutter speeds for these different environments and capturing a bird flying or capturing stars, things like that. And again, another diagram that you can see that shutter speed, the longer that the shutter speed is open here, it allows in more light. It's also called the longer exposure. This creates motion blur and camera shake, so you do need a tripod or setting it on a stable surface. And then the more that the shutter speed increases and it's faster, this allows in less light. This is a shorter exposure, it freezes action, and it is easy for handheld. Another example here with a fast shutter speed at 120th of a second. Not the fastest, but still you can see that the light trails here, like they are a bit frozen versus a slow shutter speed, which is 4 seconds. You can see that there is a lot of light trails happening. And like you wouldn't actually see this in real life with your eyes, but it's something that you can create in a camera, which is really cool. So this is a long exposure on the right side. So another just visual of how image brightness changes with shutter speed. Again, we talked about how aperture, the larger your aperture, like a f2, that's going to let in more light versus a smaller aperture, f22, that's going to let in less light. So that's going to affect the brightness. Same thing, a quicker shutter speed is going to make the image darker, whereas a longer shutter speed, like um, uh, half of a second, that's going to make the image a lot lighter. So this is Milk Drop Coronet, and this is an image that I saw back when I was in school, and it's definitely something that really um, influenced me. I thought it was super cool to see this image and see literally a milk drop happening and seeing this little crown being made. So this was shot by Harold Edgerton in 1957, and this video is also linked in our Canvas page, so please watch it when you have time. It's super cool, and you get to also see all his different types of high-speed photography and how he created something like this. Because actually this photo is like pretty much like a macro shot. So that means that you're getting really, really close to the image. I know it looks big because the image is large, but actually that droplet is super small. So definitely watch this video as well. And the other video I have for you here is a actual video of Edward Muybridge, The Horse in Motion. So this is like one of the first films ever made, which was used by taking a series of photos. So kind of like a GIF or a GIF, however you say it, but like image after image to create a moving image and basically making a film. So his question was, when a horse trots or gallops, does it ever fully become airborne? And you can see yes, in this image here, it does become airborne. So he wanted to know if that was really something that happened because we couldn't see it with our own eyes. But that's a great thing about photography is that it can really just freeze motion and you can see things that you wouldn't be able to see with your own eyes. And this question was answered in 1878. As a horse sped by, it tripped wires connected to the cameras, which took 12 photos in rapid succession. So he set up 12 different cameras, and the horse was basically speeding by and tripping the wires that were connected to the cameras, basically letting the 12 cameras go off and take photos. And Muybridge developed the image on site, and in the frames revealed that a horse is completely aloft with its hooves tucked underneath it for a brief moment during a stride. The revelation, imperceptible to the naked eye but apparent through photography, marked a new purpose for the medium. It could capture truth through technology. Muybridge's stop-motion technique was an early form of animation that helped pave the way for the motion picture industry, born a short decade later. All right, moving on to ISO. So ISO stands for International Standards Organization, if you were curious, but we refer it to ISO or ISO. So also tomato, tomato, whatever way you want to say it. But this is how much light do you want to add? How much light do you want to make up for? This is your camera, the sensor is making it more sensitive to light, increasing the ISO or decreasing the ISO. So how dark or light you can make an image. You can see here at 100 ISO, there's not a lot of grain, but as you get up to like something like even 800 ISO, 1600 ISO, 3200 ISO, there's more and more grain. And this also depends on your camera and just like the different type of technology and how well it can show or hide grain rather. But the more you pump up your ISO, the higher the number goes, the more grain you will get. because your camera is making up for that sensitivity and increasing the light. And there's a point where it just can't really get there, so that's where you get a lot of noise. So here's an example of that. If we just were in a completely dark room, what ISO looks like. You can see RGB in there, red, green, blue, these little dots of green. They increase over time. So 100 ISO doesn't really have any of this noise, but all the way up to obviously 3200, you can see there's a lot of noise happening. The camera is getting more and more sensitive to light and allowing and trying to make up for more light, thus creating more noise. This can be seen visually here through these examples. Let's say this is like 6 p.m. There's somehow you can still, well, 6 p.m. in the summer, you can still see a rainbow happening here outside, depending on your settings. The ISO is at 100. It's pretty dark. You keep on increasing it all the way to 1600. Here you can't really see exactly like noise happening, but you can see the image getting brighter, and you can see how pumping up your ISO, bringing it up to 400, 800, 1600, the image is getting brighter versus like at 100 ISO, it's too dark. Some more examples here. And at ISO 100, you can see that the flower here is a lot darker. It's probably not how it looks like in real life. Maybe it's something closer to in between 100 to 400 ISO. But as we get to ISO 6400, the image is overexposed and it's like really bright. You can't see any details in the background. So the light is getting, or the camera is getting even more sensitive to light, your sensor rather. So it's just like a lot of the information is being lost. And here you can see at an ISO 100, there's not a lot of noise happening or grain, but at ISO 3200, there is a lot of noise happening or grain. So this is another little graph here, which ISO should I use? In like sunny day, bright light, ISO 100 is usually recommended because you have the sun making up all that light for you. You don't need a lot of ISO. ISO is usually used in like darker environments. So usually when it's like cloudy, you would do something like 400 ISO if you're outside. If you're indoors and you've only got like a couple of lights on, you'll want to use an ISO 1600. Or if you're like outside for if you're outside at night, you'll want to use something like 3200. And this is going to create more noise the higher your ISO is versus less noise when you have a lot of light in the outside world or the interior environment. If you're taking a studio image with a lot of like a lot of different lights that you have, those will also help with lighting the image, so you don't need such a high ISO. And when you combine them all together, this creates exposure. So just know that you'll have to adjust all of these. Sometimes you'll have to think like maybe the purpose of your photo is more about capturing motion. So then that would be, you're thinking more about prioritizing how much motion you want. Like if you're outside and you're taking a photo of a car and you want it to pass by and blur, you would have your shutter speed at 1/4 of a second. So then maybe aperture isn't as important. I mean, obviously plays a role because it depends on how much do you want in focus. If you're taking a photo of like a car passing a building, maybe you want that building in focus. So then you would want something like an f32, but you're still blurring that motion in the front with the car passing by. So they obviously work together, shutter speed and ISO, but sometimes maybe more the image is about motion versus actually like how much you want blurred. But a lot of the time, it is about aperture and focusing on the subject and what you want to show in your image. So we do often think about aperture first, and then kind of like use maybe like the generic would be shutter speed at 125th of a second or 2/50th of a second, so that you have a good like base of you freezing any sort of motion, but not needing to go any higher than that. And then thinking about how much aperture you want, if you want a shallower depth of field or if you want a deeper depth of field. And then also making up for any light lost or creating more light by then thinking about the ISO. Of course, depending on if we're outside and it's sunny out, you would use something like an ISO 100 versus like if you're in a really dark lit space, you would use something like 1600 and above. But the more higher your ISO is, the more noise grain you're going to get. And I know that's becoming like more trendy nowadays again. Before, like, we didn't want any grain at all, but I know that things are reverting back to like wanting cool effects and having noise grain and not being so not really wanting the perfect image anymore, quote unquote. So like noise grain is more accepted, and sometimes maybe we want that kind of look and that effect. Yeah, so definitely look at this to understand that all of these things change the exposure. The aperture makes things lighter or darker depending on how large and open the aperture is versus how closed down and small the shutters, or sorry, the aperture is here. And then the shutter speed, the longer the shutter speed is open at like a half of a second, that's letting more light in, versus a thousandth of a second, that's freezing motion. So the shutter is clicking really fast and not letting a lot of light in. ISO at 100, this is like just using the environment and the light that's in the room, that's available. So maybe you're outside and you can use something like that, or you're in like a concert and you need to really pump up that ISO, you need that extra light, you would do something 1600 and above. Of course, that's going to add more grain as well. So those all affect exposure and create the exposure triangle. So I know we kind of saw an image similar to this, but as you can see, the words brighter, brighter, brighter all around. All of these things, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, make things brighter or darker in your camera. Next up is the light meter. So the light meter helps us understand if we've taken a properly exposed image. You can see the light meter inside your camera, and this is what reads the image in the outside world and lets us know if we need to make any sort of adjustment. So it's a nice little good cheat sheet and something you should be looking at, because it really does help you take a nice image overall if you're like, maybe you're not really understanding aperture and shutter speed and ISO. When you're looking at the light meter, that helps you to determine if your image is properly exposed. So each adjustment made to aperture, shutter speed, and ISO will adjust the light meter in your camera. Also, when you're looking in your camera and you're like even just like moving it around in the space that you're at, if you go to different rooms, you'll see the light meter changing because it's showing you that either that area is too dark or too light. So if none of this makes sense in talking about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, which I hope it will make sense eventually, just remember this. Remember the light meter, that you can go to it, and remember that you want the light meter at 0, which means properly exposed. So here we're looking at the light meter up close. 0 is perfect exposure. If you see anything that's negative numbers, that's underexposure, and if you see anything that's plus in the numbers, that's overexposure. So as you can see here, underexposure, if it's at -2 here in the light meter, the image is very, very dark. These buildings, they're all shadow. You can't get any detail from that. The sky is really dark. This doesn't look like the proper time of day when you're looking at it, because we do want to like kind of match what we're seeing with our own eyes. When you think about photography, you're trying to capture the image as it is. Not necessarily always the case, but something to just kind of beginners, that's the way that you can think. And so then here, overexposed, you can see that you can see the buildings up front, but the sky is completely gone. There's no detail in there whatsoever that you can actually get back if you try to edit this image, like you won't be able to get any of this information back. Whereas if it's underexposed, you can get some information back here. I just don't know how bright you can make things. So we want to aim for something like a normal exposure here, where this would be at 0, and overexposed would be like +1, +2. But here at 0, perfect exposure, you can see that the buildings are all lit up. Nothing is too light or too dark. The sky is not too bright. Everything is nice and properly exposed. Another example here, but here you can see the light meter, -2, decreased exposure, or underexposed, increased exposure, +2, overexposed, there's too many highlights, it's too bright, and then standard exposure right here at 0, there's a good amount of dark and light in there. Some more examples of when you're actually looking into your viewfinder where that light meter is, and you can see it moving all around when you change different environments, or even when you move your camera around. So you want to aim to have it right in the middle at 0. And then you can also see these other numbers here, the 2.8 right here, that's your aperture. ISO, you can see that's at 400. And then over here, you can see this is your shutter speed at 400 as well. So these are the differences here between Nikon cameras and Canon cameras. And just like the back of your camera, the display of where you see all the different functions, the menu, these will look different. So you'll have to look at your manual and see how to operate these, or you can watch like a YouTube video for your specific camera to know how to change these around and change the f-stop, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Same thing for Canon. It just looks different, but they're the same settings. So I have a tip for you for Canon Rebels. If you want to change your different functions while still kind of doing it all with one hand, you can basically click on the AV button at the same time as moving the dial, which is usually around here. Sometimes there's a dial over here as well, to change apertures. And some cameras have two dials, like I just said. You'll have to figure out which one works for aperture. Most likely the other dial will work for shutter speed. So this is if you like, let's say you don't have a touch screen, that's how you would change these two, these two, the shutter speed or the aperture with the different dials and holding the AV button. And then the Q button for this particular background for the Canon Rebel, if you click the Q button, this will navigate to the screen, and that's how you can move left and right with the buttons below right here. Left and right, that's how you can navigate through the screen. And then if you don't really have a screen that shows you like this in the back, this is how you would see it from the top. And you can also adjust these numbers with the same settings. Like usually this top dial, this would be aperture or shutter speed, or there's also like a button, like a dial in the back that will also change either the shutter speed or the aperture. So you'll have to look into that. And then the ISO, you can just click on ISO and then probably move this dial and that will change the ISO. So it's all using like ergonomics and being able to do everything just with one hand. So manual versus autofocus. Manual, basically on the side of your lens, usually the left side, there should be a button slider that you can change from manual to autofocus. And manual focus allows you to control the focus of your lens manually. There should be a ring that moves on your lens. This is not the zoom of your lens, which will also move, but this is just like a small ring. And you can basically see things fall in and out of focus. So I will show a visual information on the next slide. But basically, these are the little components here, the little slider. It may say AF or MF, manual focus, autofocus, and you can change that there by just moving the little slider. And then the focus ring is right here. So if you wanted to manually focus, you could do that here and then zooming in and out. This is the bigger ring here. But autofocus, this is also, like I said, you can find it here, autofocus. You can change that on the side of your lens. And this is the camera controlling the autofocus automatically, depending on where you're putting, where you're focusing on in your image. And this, you'll usually hear a beep when you click the shutter button. You kind of like half press the shutter button to focus and then fully click. And when you half click, you'll hear that little beep. And then that's when you focus, and then you can go ahead and click the shutter. So that's how you use autofocus. And either one, that's up to you. When I first started taking photos, I was using manual focus, but honestly, the camera eye is much better than our own eyes. It can really see things so much better than we can. So a lot of times when you're taking photos in manual mode, when you blow it up on your computer to edit your photos, it might not be in focus. So autofocus is really great because it makes sure what you're focusing on is in focus. So it's up to you. Definitely play around with manual focus and autofocus. And then the next part is JPEG versus RAW. For this class, you want to make sure that you're always photographing in RAW because RAW is uncompressed. The file stores more tonal and color data. It has superior colors than when compared to JPEG images. it offers a lot more creative processing flexibility. You can really like pull a lot of tones and shadows and highlights because you're in an uncompressed image format. And so we want to be in raw image format here rather than JPEG. JPEG is compressed, um, and basically it's just a standard file format. It's easily shareable, but there's a lot of loss of detail and color range. For example, when you're like uploading JPEGs to your phone or to your a website, those are easily shareable things, but they won't take up a lot of space in terms of the file size. But the image itself isn't going to be the best quality, whereas a raw image, when we eventually use editing software, we can take a raw image, edit it, and then turn it into a JPEG, which will be the process, so that you can then use that JPEG and upload it wherever, but you still have the raw original file. So you never want to upload a raw file anywhere else. The raw files, that's like your original, so you always want to keep on a hold of that, and then you can export it as a JPEG and give that to someone, or you can put it on the web. But yeah, your raw is like your original image that's uncompressed, and you don't really want to give that to anybody. So the process, oh, sorry, I actually just wanted to go back a couple slides here. And yeah, so in your camera, I think will be another video talking about how to set um, your image quality here and like how your images are stored in RAW or JPEG. So this is JPEG and this is in RAW, and you can change these settings as well, but this is allowing you to take photos in RAW and JPEG. This is also going to add more storage into your SD card, so it's going to eat up a lot of that storage right away. So just make sure you're only in RAW mode. Honestly, sometimes it's good to have RAW and JPEG if, like, let's say you have a client and you wanted to send them JPEGs right away and it's unedited. If that situation isn't always a situation that happens, yeah, but I would always just photograph only in RAW mode because RAW files take up a lot of storage space. They are really big files. And because they are uncompressed, you just want to make sure that you have a lot of storage on your SD card still. So only shoot in RAW. You don't need the extra JPEG there. So I just wanted to show you that. And then the process for photographing in manual mode, these are things that you want to think about. Determine the ISO for the environment you are in. So if you're in a sunny outdoor situation, your ISO can remain at 100, or if you're in a lighting studio and you've got a lot of lights, you can stay at ISO 100. But like, let's say you're taking photos in the dark or at night, yeah, or inside, the ISO will be like, you'll need to pump it from 400 and above all the way to 1600 and so on and so forth. How much depth do you want in your image? This is relying on aperture. Do you want a shallow depth of field, something like f2, where there's a lot of light coming in, but you've got that blurry background? Or do you want a deeper depth of field, like something like f16, where not a lot of light is coming in, there's a deeper depth of field and a smaller aperture overall. So that's allowing for everything to be in focus in your image. Or do you want something kind of in the middle with both of the kind of blurriness and also things in focus, which would be an aperture of like f5.6, for example, or f8. So you would also want to consider how much or how little movement do you want to freeze? Thinking about shutter speed, do you want blur in your image, or do you want the image to be completely frozen? So blur would be like something like a 30th of a second and under, all the way up to like 1 second, or if you want to go all the way to something like a thousandth of a second or 2 thousandths of a second, that's really fast shutter speed, and you're freezing that motion. Like I said, 2 and 3 can kind of be interchangeable depending on your preference, aperture and shutter speed, really determining what is more important for you. Is it the motion, or is it the amount of blurriness, the amount of things that are focused when using your aperture? So go ahead and get comfortable with your shooting menu. Look at your manual of your camera. Get the settings right. Make sure you are in RAW mode. I will say that 100 times. I also wanted to point out an NEF. That is a RAW file format for a Nikon camera. whereas Canon cameras are CR2, I believe. And these are all different. They're all RAW formats, but like when you pull them up into your computer later on when we start editing, you'll see like .nef or .cr2. Those are CR2 would be Canon, NEF would be um, Nikon. There's also ARW, that would be for Sony. So those are all RAW modes, but just with different names, so different image qualities. And then, sorry, here. Next, here we have just different settings for your camera and different tips. And I also just was kind of looking here at the white balance and ISO sensitivities. And those are things that we'll talk about. We already talked about ISO sensitivity, but white balance. For now, I would say that you want to keep your white balance at auto white balance. I'll get more into white balance in a couple of weeks, but these should be your kind of settings that you have. Make sure you're set in M for manual mode. So on your dial, make sure that's on M for manual mode. And then your quality should be set to raw. White balance, you can have it at auto white balance, or you can play with the other auto white balances, or sorry, the other white balances as well. You'll see like different kind of settings, like a little sun for daylight if you're outside, or a little cloud for cloudy or tungsten types of settings. So you'll be able to see that in your camera. But auto white balance, I consider to be fine. And then manual or autofocus mode, like I said, this can be found on the side of your lens and may read M or A, MF or AF. And then when it comes to formatting your card, this means that you're going to be erasing everything from your card. When you have only one SD card, and like for example, for this class, you might have a 16 gigabyte card, that can't hold as many raw files, but it can still hold a lot. So eventually what you'll have to do is you'll have to take those raw files, upload it to your computer, and we'll go through those steps when we get there. But then you'll eventually need to take more photos. And if your SD card is full, you need to delete those photos from there. So formatting your card, this will delete everything. And I just wanted to make that very clear. Like it will delete everything. So make sure you have your photos backed up. They should be on your computer. They should be in your hard drive before you even consider formatting the card, because formatting the card will delete everything. So make sure you save your images. They're backed up before formatting your card, because again, formatting card will delete everything. And we do have to format our cards in order to use our cards again. Unless you want to have like a whole, storage of a bunch of different SD cards that you never get rid of, but we want to make sure that we're like responsible and that we back things up so that we can use that card over and over again. I would recommend not deleting images off your SD card or CF cards in the camera one by one, because sometimes when you look in your little screen from your computer, your LCD screen, things can look not as good, but when you blow it up on your computer, it looks a lot better. So I would just recommend not deleting things off. Plus, for the first couple of weeks, I do want to see like everything you photographed. So just make sure you keep your images. And then we can also do this when we organize our files in Lightroom. And like I said, even if a photo looks blurry, it might look cool blown up on your computer screen versus the tiny screen on the back of your camera. So just don't delete your photos off of your camera. And yeah, that's everything. So I hope you learned a lot in this presentation. And also go ahead and play with your cameras, look back at this presentation, look back at the PDF that I'll be putting in Canvas, and have a lot of fun, enjoy. Make sure you are on manual mode, that you're photographing in RAW, and yeah, those are the two most important things. So have fun with your camera and starting to learn how to use it. Thanks, everyone.